All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into the life of Richard Nixon.
Richard Nixon, huh?
Yeah, when you're talking about someone like Nixon, a figure who's been studied and written about so much, so often when people think Nixon, they just think one word.
Watergate.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's all anyone remembers.
But that's just scratching the surface. It's like, reading one chapter of a book and thinking, the whole story.
Right.
What we're going to try to do today is, look at the whole picture.
A whole Nixon, huh?
Exactly. We're talking about the ambition, the contradictions, all the stuff that made him, Nixon. And to really get that, I think you have to go back to the beginning, his childhood. And let me tell you, it was anything but easy.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Born in Yorba Linda, California, raised Quaker, families trying to keep their lemon ranch going.
A lemon ranch, wow.
And they end up having to move to Whittier.
Not exactly a life of privilege, huh?
Not at all. And, he actually later quoted Eisenhower saying, "We were poor, but the glory of it was we didn't know it."
That's interesting. But you have to wonder, did they truly not realize they were struggling?
Right. Or did it, shape him in a way, that whole experience of hardship,
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine it might have fueled some resentment, maybe even a drive to prove himself.
Exactly.
And there are actually some pretty interesting details about his childhood that show, that resilience, even then.
Like what?
Well, for instance, he wasn't allowed to play sports. Had this spot on his lung, turned out to be just scar tissue. But back then...
They didn't know.
Exactly. So he ends up putting all that energy into academics, into debate. Imagine, he was spending hours every day just on a bus, just to get to a good high school.
Really?
Yeah, and all those debate skills.
Well, came in handy later on.
Oh, you better believe it. Those were his tools for the political battles ahead.
It's like he was preparing without even knowing it.
Even in college, you see that same pattern. Snubbed by a fraternity, so what does he do? He helps found a new one, breaks off an engagement, but eventually finds love with Pat Ryan.
There's definitely a theme here.
It's like, I'll make my own way, thank you very much.
Yeah, forging his own path. And then World War II hits. Now, remember, he's a Quaker, but he enlists in the Navy anyway, serves in the South Pacific.
This is actually where we start to see that tricky dick side of him emerging.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, he gets really good at poker while he's in the Navy. And guess what he uses his winnings for?
What?
To finance his first campaign.
No way. So that nickname, maybe it wasn't so far off.
Well, maybe not. But you got to remember the context here. When Nixon comes back from the war, he's diving headfirst into politics. And guess what's the big issue of the day?
Anti-communism. It was like the defining force in politics then, right?
Exactly. And Nixon, he uses that to his advantage. 1946, runs for Congress, and guess what his strategy is?
Targeting his opponent's supposed communist ties, wasn't it?
You got it. It wasn't exactly a clean campaign, but hey, it worked. He gets elected.
And then comes HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Oh yeah, this is where Nixon really starts making a name for himself nationally.
The Alger Hiss case.
Right. Hiss was a former State Department official. The accusations were flying that he was a Soviet spy.
And Nixon was all over it.
Oh, absolutely. He was relentless. Pushed that investigation even when others were like, I don't know about this.
But Nixon, he just kept digging.
And you know what? He was right. The pumpkin papers, remember those?
Microfilm hidden in a pumpkin? Craziness.
It was like something out of a spy movie.
It was huge.
Huge win for Nixon. Suddenly, he's this national figure, the anti-communist crusader, the guy who gets results.
That case really put him on the map.
It was like a launch pad. And he doesn't slow down. He wins the Senate seat in 1950, keeps going after those communists, but he's also playing the game, being strategic, even with someone like Senator McCarthy.
McCarthy, yeah. He was a force of nature back then.
No kidding. And Nixon, he agreed with McCarthy on the whole communist thing, but
he didn't want to get caught up in all the, the drama. Exactly. And that's smart, right? Because then in 1952, Eisenhower picks him as his running mate.
It seemed like the perfect ticket at the time.
Yeah, Eisenhower, the war hero, and Nixon, this young, up-and-coming politician with appeal in California.
A real power duo. And then, boom, the fund crisis hits.
The secret slush fund, right?
The one and only. It could have been curtains for his career. People were calling for him to step down.
But then we get the Checkers speech.
The Checkers speech. Classic.
Nixon goes on TV, and he just lays it all out there. The humble upbringing, his wife's simple coat.
And of course, Checkers, the dog. The dog he refuses to return.
It was brilliant. He turned the whole thing around, played the victim card, and it worked.
Oh, it worked like a charm. People loved it. Eisenhower stuck by him, And they won the election.
That speech, I think it shows just how well Nixon understood the power of television.
Oh, absolutely. He knew how to play to the audience, how to control the narrative.
And then he becomes vice president. He's traveling all over the world, stepping up when Eisenhower has health issues. It's like he's being groomed for the top job.
But there's this one incident, I think, that really shows his boldness on the world stage.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
All right, so picture this. 1958, Nixon's on a tour of South America.
Sounds nice.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
He's met with these intense anti-American protests. I mean, his car even gets attacked.
Whoa.
But instead of backing down, he stands his ground, shows this real, grit. Even some of his critics were impressed. They saw this side of him, this tough, resilient side that wasn't afraid of a fight.
It's like people forget he had that in him.
It's easy to just remember the scandal. But Nixon was a complex guy. There was a lot more to him than meets the eye.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, isn't it?
Exactly. And we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to uncover about his path to the presidency, the setbacks, the triumphs, the whole story.
Well, we've got a lot more deep diving to do.
Good. We're just getting started.
So last time, we left off with Nixon as vice president, right? Really making a name for himself on the world stage.
Yeah, but we all know where he really wanted to be, the Oval Office. Top job.
And he got pretty close in 1960.
Oh, that election against Kennedy? Talk about a nail-biter. One of the closest in American history.
And all that controversy, the allegations of voter fraud in those key states like Texas and Illinois.
It was intense. Some people were actually pushing Nixon to challenge the results, to demand a recount.
Wow, I bet that must have been tempting to be that close to the presidency.
It was a huge decision. And honestly, it could have gone either way. But in the end, Nixon chose to concede.
Really? I wonder what went into that decision.
Well, he believed, at least that's what he said, that dragging the country through a legal battle would just cause more division, especially when, everyone was already on edge.
Makes sense. It was a time when, unity was really important.
Exactly. But you got to figure that loss, it had to sting. And then just 2 years later, he runs for governor of California, and
he loses again.
Yeah, not a good look.
Yeah.
And that's when we get the last press conference speech.
The one where he says, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore?
That's the one. Talk about bitters. That speech really cemented the image of Nixon as, resentful, even paranoid.
He seemed pretty defeated.
Oh, absolutely. Disillusioned with the whole political game. He steps back, moves to New York City, focuses on his law career, like he's done with it all.
But Nixon being Nixon, he's not going to stay quiet for long.
You can't keep a good politician down, right?
And sure enough, in 1966, he's back, campaigning for Republicans in the midterms.
And guess what? It works. Republicans make some gains in Congress, and suddenly, Nixon's back in the game.
Talk about perfect timing. 1968 rolls around, and it's, chaos. Vietnam's escalating, there are riots in the cities, assassinations, the whole country's on edge.
And Nixon, he sees an opportunity. The public's looking for stability, someone who can, bring back a sense of order.
Law and order.
Exactly. That was his message. And it resonated. People were tired of the turmoil. They wanted things to go back to, the way they were.
And Nixon, he was the guy who promised to do that.
He promised peace with honor in Vietnam, a return to traditional values. He even appealed to what he called the silent majority.
The people who felt like their voices weren't being heard.
Exactly. And it worked. He wins the election, a three-way race against Humphrey and Wallace, and suddenly, Richard Nixon is the president of the United States.
A pretty remarkable comeback story when you think about it.
It really is. But his presidency, well, it was a roller coaster. I mean, you can't talk about Nixon without talking about Watergate.
Yeah, that's the one thing everyone remembers.
It's the scandal that defines him.
Yeah.
But there was so much more to his presidency than just that. He had some major achievements, but also some really tough decisions, some, questionable choices.
So let's break it down. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with foreign policy, because that's where Nixon really made his mark.
Like his trip to China in 1972, that was a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. A historic moment. Nixon goes to Beijing, shakes hands with Mao Zedong. It was like the whole world stopped and watched.
It was a bold move. After decades of hostility, suddenly the US and China are talking.
And it had this ripple effect, right? The Soviet Union, they're looking at this and thinking, uh-oh, what's going on here?
They don't want to be left out.
Exactly. So suddenly, They're more open to détente, to easing tensions with the West.
And Nixon, he takes advantage of that. He starts negotiating arms control agreements with the Soviets, like the SALT-I and anti-ballistic missile treaties.
All aimed at reducing the threat of nuclear war. I mean, these were huge achievements.
It shows you that, Nixon was a pragmatist. He was willing to work with anyone, even America's enemies, if it meant getting results.
He understood that the world was a complicated place, and sometimes you got to make deals with the devil to get things done.
But then there's Vietnam. That was a whole other story.
Oh yeah, Vietnam. A real mess. Nixon inherits this war that's deeply unpopular, and he's trying to figure out how to get out of it.
He comes up with Vietnamization, right? Gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while training the South Vietnamese to take over.
It made sense on paper, but it was a long, painful process.
Yeah.
And then there's the bombing of Cambodia.
Trying to disrupt those North Vietnamese supply lines.
But it backfired. Caused a huge uproar back home, protests, outrage. It just added fuel to the fire.
Vietnam was a real thorn in Nixon's side, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It divided the country. It haunted his presidency.
Yeah.
But to his credit, he did eventually manage to negotiate a peace agreement, the Paris Peace Accords, in 1973.
It wasn't perfect, but at least it got the U.S. out of the war.
Right. And it gave Nixon some breathing room to focus on other things like domestic policy. And, he actually did some surprising things on that front.
Like what?
Well, for starters, he creates the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Now, this was a big deal, especially for a Republican. I mean, a lot of people thought he was betraying his own party.
But he also signs the Clean Air Act, supports other environmental initiatives. It's like a whole different side of Nixon that most people don't know about.
It shows that he was willing to think outside the box, to go against the grain, even if it meant alienating some of his supporters.
And then there's his fight against inflation. He goes and imposes wage and price controls.
Yeah, that was a bold move. And again, not exactly something you'd expect from a free market Republican.
But it shows he was willing to do whatever it took to get the economy back on track.
He wanted to be seen as a president who could get things done, regardless of the political cost.
And it worked. I mean, going into the 1972 election, he was incredibly popular. He wins in a landslide against McGovern.
It was a huge victory, a clear mandate from the American people.
He seemed unstoppable, like he was going to reshape the country, both domestically and on the world stage.
It looked that way.
Yeah.
But then, of course, Watergate happened. It's like this dark cloud hanging over everything.
It all started with that break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, right?
Yes, a seemingly minor incident that would spiral out of control and bring down a president.
It's hard to believe something like that could have such a huge impact.
It just goes to show that even the most powerful people are vulnerable. And that the truth, well, it has a way of coming out.
And that truth, that's what we're going to dive into next time. The whole Watergate saga, the cover-up, the tapes, the resignation. It's a story that's both fascinating and, a little bit terrifying.
Yeah, it's a reminder that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
It's a story for the ages. And we'll be back to unpack it all next time. It's kind of crazy to think about, Just a few months after that big election win, Nixon's world starts falling apart.
Yeah, and all because of a break-in.
The Watergate Hotel Democratic National Committee headquarters.
At first, it didn't seem like much, right?
5 guys arrested for burglary.
Like, who cares?
But then you had these 2 reporters from the Washington Post.
Woodward and Bernstein.
Yeah, those guys, they weren't buying it. They thought there was more to the story.
They were right.
Oh yeah, they started digging, following the money trail, and guess what?
It all led back to the White House.
I mean, it's like something out of a movie.
They had this secret source, too. Deep Throat.
Who turned out to be, what, Mark Felt? An FBI guy?
Yeah, high up in the FBI. And he gave them all these crucial bits of information, helped them connect the dots.
And the whole thing was just so complicated.
Hush money, wiretaps, you name it.
And then there was CREEP, the Committee for the Re-election of the President.
Nixon's campaign team, basically.
It was a mess.
A big mess.
But the real turning point, the thing that really brought Nixon down, were the tapes.
Ah, the tapes.
He had this secret recording system in the Oval Office, taping all his conversations.
Every single one.
And when Congress found out about those tapes, well, they wanted them.
They subpoenaed them.
But Nixon, he refused, said it was executive privilege.
Like he was above the law.
But the Supreme Court, they said, nope, you gotta hand them over.
And those tapes, oh man, they were bad news for Nixon.
There was one in particular, they called it the smoking gun tape.
It proved that Nixon knew about the cover-up all along.
He'd been lying to the American people.
Obstructing justice.
It was over for him.
He lost support in Congress. Even his own party turned against him.
Impeachment was a sure thing.
He had no choice but to resign.
August 9th, 1974, he gives that farewell address from the Oval Office, and then he's gone.
It's a pretty dramatic ending, isn't it?
A real fall from grace.
But, it's not quite the end of the story.
What do you mean?
Well, he gets pardoned by President Ford, which was super controversial.
It meant he wouldn't face any criminal charges.
But a lot of people felt like he got off easy.
Like he didn't really face the consequences of his actions.
Right. But anyway, Nixon goes back to California, kind of disappears for a while.
Trying to rebuild his life, I guess.
Yeah, he starts writing his memoirs, gives some interviews, tries to explain his side of things.
He even becomes this sort of elder statesman, advising presidents, meeting with world leaders.
It's kind of wild if you think about it. The guy who resigned in disgrace becomes this respected figure on the world stage.
Nixon, he was full of surprises, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, he was a complicated guy. A brilliant politician, no doubt about it, but also deeply flawed.
Capable of great things, but also capable of, some pretty bad stuff.
It's what makes him so fascinating, I think. He's this reminder that power is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, it can corrupt even the best of us.
And that even the most powerful people are human, they make mistakes, they have their weaknesses.
It's a lesson we all need to remember, I think. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of Richard Nixon, I gotta ask you, what stuck with you the most? What are you gonna walk away thinking about?
That's a good question. I guess what struck me the most is how relevant his story still feels today.
Yeah, even decades later.
We're still grappling with a lot of the same issues. The abuse of power, the importance of truth and accountability.
It's like his story is a warning, a reminder to be vigilant, to hold our leaders to a high standard.
Exactly. We can't let history repeat itself.
Well said. Well, I hope everyone listening learned something new today, maybe got a different perspective on Richard Nixon.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And there's still so much more to explore, so much more to learn about this complex and controversial figure.
The study of history never really ends, does it?
Nope. There's always something new to discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.